There's a very simple way to see who someone really is. Not in what they say, not in what they show off, but in how they treat a person they believe can do absolutely nothing for them. I've seen that pattern repeat itself so many times. It stopped being a coincidence. It became a rule. The people who look at a quiet old man, dressed simply, and see nothing worth respecting, are almost always the ones about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. And that quiet old man is me. My name is Theodore Whitmore. Most people call me Teddy. I'm 67 years old, and I live on a quiet, tree-lined street in the Beverly neighborhood of Chicago, in a modest brick bungalow I bought back in 1992, when the oak trees out front were still young enough to bend in the wind. I drive a 2004 Mercury Grand Marquis, dark green, or what used to be dark green, before about 20 winters of Chicago salt and sun had their way with her. The paint is faded on the hood. The driver's side door makes a sound like an old man clearing his throat when you open it. The radio only picks up AM stations, and even those come in like they're embarrassed to be heard. My daughter Camille. She has been begging me to trade that car in for something newer for about 4 years now. I just smile at her and tell her that old Marquis and I have an understanding. We don't ask too much of each other, and we get along just fine. I wear clean clothes. Simple button-downs from Sears, back when Sears still existed. Work pants. A pair of brown leather shoes I've had resoled 3 times because a good shoe doesn't need replacing, it just needs maintaining. And you know what? I think that's something a lot of people have forgotten in this country. That taking care of what you have is its own kind of wealth. Anyway, my neighbor, a retired Chicago firefighter named Donnie O'Shaughnessy, leaned over my picket fence one Saturday afternoon last summer while I was trimming my hedges, and he said to me, "Teddy, you're the most regular guy on this whole block, and somehow I always get the feeling you know something the rest of us don't." I laughed. I told him he'd been watching too many mystery novels come to life. We talked about the Cubs for about half an hour, which in Chicago is basically a form of prayer, and then I went back inside. Now here's what Donnie doesn't know, and what the folks at St. Margaret's Parish on Sunday morning don't know, and what the young salesman at the Ford dealership on Western Avenue didn't know last spring when he tried to upgrade me to a brand new Explorer, and I politely told him the Marquis still had plenty of miles in her. I own Meridian Capital Holdings, commercial real estate across 12 states, a private equity arm, a regional media company with 3 newspapers and 2 radio stations, ownership stakes in manufacturing, logistics, and agricultural technology, all of it structured through a web of shell companies and trusts, so intricate that my name doesn't appear on any public filing you could find with a Google search. No magazine covers, no Forbes list, no charity galas with my face on a banner. I built it that way on purpose. 42 years of showing up at 5 in the morning and going to bed past midnight. 42 years of learning that the quietest decisions are almost always the best ones. Meridian Capital is worth $2.8 billion. And I drive a car with a cracked taillight cover held together with a piece of clear packing tape that I put on there 3 winters ago, and I have never, not for one single second, wished I were doing it differently. And listen, I want to stop right here for a second, because I think this is important. I think in America today we've gotten so used to people announcing themselves, showing off, posting every single thing they own on the internet, that we've forgotten there's a whole generation of men and women quietly building things, quietly taking care of their families, quietly being the backbone of their communities, and nobody's clapping for them. Nobody's putting them on podcasts, but they're the reason this country still works. And if you grew up knowing somebody like that, a grandfather, an uncle, a neighbor, I hope you call them today, because those kinds of people are getting rarer every year. Now, let me tell you about my daughter. Camille Whitmore is 33 years old, and she is, without any exaggeration, the best thing I ever did in my entire life. She's smarter than I ever was, kinder than her mother. Elena passed 9 years ago from pancreatic cancer. God rest her beautiful soul. Camille has her mother's eyes. That same deep hazel color that turns almost gold in late afternoon sunlight. When Camille was 6 years old, She marched into my home office one Sunday evening and presented me with a hand-drawn pie chart explaining why she deserved to get a puppy, complete with arguments about responsibility, companionship, and what she called the emotional development benefits for an only child. I sat there staring at this 6-year-old with her crayon pie chart, and I thought to myself, this child is going to be something one day. I was right. What I was not ready for was who she was going to marry. 3 years ago, Camille brought home a man named Preston Vance, and I want to be fair to Preston. I really do. I've lived long enough to know that first impressions can lie, and that a father's instincts about the man his daughter loves can be more about the father than the man. So let me describe Preston as charitably as I can. Preston Vance is the kind of man who tells you what prep school he went to within the first 10 minutes of meeting you, even when nobody asked. He's 37 years old, tall, good-looking in that very deliberate way that men who spend a lot of time at the gym and even more time looking at themselves in the mirror tend to be. He wears Italian suits that fit a little too tight across the shoulders, because the fit is the point. He wears a watch that costs more than my first house did. And he has this particular habit, a habit I've noticed in a very specific kind of ambitious young man, of steering every single conversation, no matter what it's about, back to something he has achieved, something he owns, or somewhere impressive he has recently been. Within the first 20 minutes of meeting me, Preston managed to mention his Wharton MBA, his membership at a private golf club in Lake Forest, and a recent business trip to Zurich. Zurich. He said it the way people say Zurich when they want you to know they have been to Zurich. I smiled. I said, "Well, that sounds like a mighty fine trip, son." I filed it away. You know, if I'm being honest with you, I think a lot of us have met a Preston Vance in our lives. Maybe it's a coworker. Maybe it's somebody's husband at a family wedding. Maybe it's the guy who sat behind you at a conference and told you 6 times what firm he works for. And I think the mistake we make is assuming those men are just annoying. They're not just annoying, they're telling you something important about themselves. They're telling you what they're afraid of. And Preston was afraid of being invisible. So he made sure everyone in every room knew exactly who he was, or who he wanted to be. 6 months after meeting my daughter, Preston Vance was appointed Chief Executive Officer of Halverson Freight Solutions, a mid-sized trucking and logistics company based out of the Kansas City area with 387 employees. Now, here is where the story gets very, very interesting. And I need you to stay with me, because this is the part nobody ever sees coming. Halverson Freight Solutions is one of Meridian Capital's subsidiaries, a good, honest company. Real trucks, real drivers, real contracts with major food distributors and retailers across the Midwest. Preston got that CEO job through what looked from every angle like a completely standard executive search, a reputable headhunting firm in Dallas. 4 rounds of interviews, background checks, reference calls, board approval, compensation negotiations. All of it clean, all of it textbook. What Preston Vance did not know, what he still does not know to this very day, is that I personally controlled every single stage of that process from beginning to end. I reviewed his interview recordings through a private arrangement with the search firm. I spoke with 3 of his former colleagues myself, under a different name and a different pretense. I read every single evaluation the board submitted. I personally approved his salary, his equity grant, and his signing bonus, and then I went home. I changed into my flannel shirt and my old work pants. I planted 2 new rose bushes along the back fence. I made myself a grilled cheese sandwich and watched the evening news. Preston sent me a text message that night. He wrote, quote, "Huge news. Just accepted a CEO position. Camille is over the moon. Hard work really does pay off." I replied, "Congratulations, son. Very happy for you." Then I put my phone down and I went to bed. Now, if I were sitting in your living room right now, I'd want to say this directly to you. I want to be honest. In the beginning, I really did want Preston to succeed. I did. Because if he succeeded, my daughter was happy. And a father. A real father. He doesn't care about being right. He cares about his child being loved. So I gave Preston every chance. Every single one. I watched him. I waited. I hoped. Preston did not disappoint me because he failed at the job. Preston disappointed me because of who he slowly revealed himself to be. It started small. It always starts small, doesn't it? It was a 4th of July backyard gathering at Camille and Preston's place up in Lincoln Park, and Preston had invited some of his Halverson colleagues. A young executive vice president with too much cologne asked me what I did for a living. Before I could even open my mouth, Preston jumped in and said, and I quote exactly, "Oh, he's retired. Camille's dad was in something back in the day. Enjoy the burgers, Mr. Whitmore." And just like that, I was dismissed. Shuffled along like somebody who had accidentally wandered into a conversation that wasn't meant for him. I smiled. I walked over to the picnic table. I helped Camille's friend serve potato salad. I filed it away. And I'll tell you something. If you've ever been in that position, where somebody speaks for you in a room full of strangers and cuts you down to about half your actual size without even realizing they did it, you know exactly the feeling I'm describing. It's not anger. It's something quieter than anger. It's the feeling of watching somebody tell the world who you are and having to decide in that moment whether correcting them is worth what the correction will cost. Most of the time, it isn't. But the moment, the specific moment that changed everything, happened about 5 months ago, on a Wednesday afternoon in early November. I had stopped by the Halverson corporate office in downtown Kansas City on a trip I'd planned through one of my holding company representatives to review some internal matters quietly. Nobody at Halverson knew I was in the building. I was, as always, unremarkable. An older man in a gray windbreaker and clean khakis, walking the hallways like maybe I was somebody's uncle visiting for a meeting. Nobody looked at me twice. And as I was walking past a small conference room near the executive suite, the door was cracked open about 6 inches. I heard Preston's voice. He was talking to another man. Sounded like the chief financial officer. I stopped just outside the door. I didn't move. I just listened. Preston was saying, "Camille's dad? Oh my God, he's harmless. Sweet old guy. I think he peaked somewhere back in the 80s, maybe did something in sales. Camille feels this, you know, obligation to him because her mom passed. She calls him every Sunday, bless her heart. He mostly just fixes up that ancient Mercury and pokes around in his garden." The other man chuckled. Preston lowered his voice a little, but not enough. He said, "Between you and me, the guy wore a J.C. Penney cardigan to Thanksgiving. A cardigan. Like a grandpa from a sitcom." They both laughed. I took a slow, steady breath. I straightened my windbreaker, and I walked quietly back the way I had come. I did not say a word. Not to Preston. Not to Camille. Not to anyone. I let those words sit with me. J.C. Penney cardigan. Peaked in the 80s. Pokes around his garden. I let them sit with me for 5 months. Because I am a patient man. I come from patient men. My father, who was a machinist at a steel plant on the south side, used to tell me when I was a boy, "Teddy, son, a river doesn't argue with a stone. The river just keeps flowing, and eventually, the stone is sand." I kept flowing. If you've been listening this far and this story is pulling you in, would you do me one quick favor and hit that subscribe button? It genuinely means the world to me, and it costs you absolutely nothing. Thank you. Let's keep going. The dinner invitation came through Camille on a Tuesday evening in early March. She called me, excited, warm, eager. Preston's parents, Richard and Vivian Vance, were hosting a formal family dinner at their estate in Winnetka, a wealthy lakefront suburb, just north of Chicago. Richard was a retired hedge fund manager. Vivienne was the kind of woman whose entire identity seemed to revolve around the width of her foyer and the pedigree of her interior decorator. Camille said, "Dad, they want to meet you properly, like a real family dinner. They've been asking. You'll love them. They're really sweet people." I said, "Of course, sweetheart. I'd be honored." And I smiled into the phone, because there were things I already knew about Richard and Vivian Vance that would have made that sentence very difficult for Camille to finish if she had known them too. But she didn't, and I wasn't going to tell her. Not yet. Then Preston called me directly, which was already unusual enough to be noteworthy. Preston and I never called each other. He was friendly, casual. The particular kind of friendly and casual that men use when they are about to say something slightly offensive but have already decided they are going to say it anyway. He said, "Hey Teddy, just a quick heads up for Saturday. Mom and Dad, they're pretty, traditional, old school, country club set. So I was thinking maybe, dress up a little, like a sports coat or something, just so everybody's comfortable. No pressure, obviously." There was a pause. I said very pleasantly, "Preston, I appreciate you looking out for me, son." He said, "Oh, of course, of course. Just want you to feel comfortable." I said, "I'll see you Saturday." I hung up the phone. I walked over to the hallway mirror, and I looked at my own reflection for a long, quiet moment, and I thought about my father. I thought about the fact that he wore his Sunday suit exactly 3 times a year. Easter, Christmas Eve, and any funeral that required his presence. The rest of the time he wore work clothes. Honest work clothes. And I thought about the kind of America we used to have, where a man's value was measured by what he built and what he stood for, not what was on the label inside his jacket. Then I walked into my bedroom. I opened my closet, and I walked past the charcoal 3-piece suit hanging at the very back, the one I wore when Meridian closed its largest acquisition in 2009, past the navy wool suit, past the custom pinstripe from a tailor in London that I had gotten 16 years ago and never worn more than a handful of times. I walked past all of it, and I pulled out my simplest outfit, clean navy chinos, a pressed white Oxford shirt, my dark brown leather shoes, and my favorite JCPenney cardigan, the color of old oatmeal. I laid it all out for Saturday, and then I walked out to the driveway in the late evening light, and I patted the roof of the marquee twice, the way you pat the shoulder of an old friend before a long road trip. I said quietly, "We're going to a dinner, old girl. Dress code is humble." Because here's what Preston Vance did not understand. Here's what Richard and Vivian Vance did not understand. Here's what nobody in that dining room on Saturday night was going to understand, until it was much too late. I wasn't dressing down because I had nothing better. I was dressing down because I wanted to see exactly who those people were when they believed nothing was at stake. And I had a very quiet, very certain, 42-year-old feeling in my chest that told me they were about to show me everything. Saturday was coming. And so was I. And listen, if you've ever been in a situation where somebody underestimated you and you had to decide how to respond, you already know the feeling I'm talking about. Most of us get angry. Most of us try to prove them wrong. But the older I get, the more I realize that the most powerful response in the world is no response at all. Let them keep underestimating. Let them keep talking. Let them keep walking right toward the truth, because the truth has its own timing, and you don't have to rush it. Saturday arrived the way all important days arrive, quietly, without drama, like it didn't know what was about to happen. I woke up at 5:30 in the morning, like I have every morning for the last 40 years, made my coffee, black, 2 scoops, from an old percolator that belonged to my father, sat at my kitchen table, looking out over the small backyard garden, where Elena and I had planted tulips together. The first spring we moved into that house. I was calm. I am always calm. Calmness, real calmness, is the single most underestimated weapon a man can carry into any room in America today. I got dressed slowly. The navy chinos, the white Oxford, the oatmeal cardigan, the brown shoes I'd had resold at a cobbler on 95th Street 3 winters ago. I looked at myself in the hallway mirror and I thought, yes, this is exactly right. I walked out to the driveway. The Mercury sat in the morning light, faded and patient. I got in. The engine coughed once, twice, then settled into its low, familiar rumble. I backed out onto my street. The Beverly neighborhood oak trees were just beginning to bud. I took Lake Shore Drive north. Lake Michigan was gray and glittering in the March light. I drove past the Chicago skyline on my right, past Lincoln Park, past Evanston, and eventually into the leafy private streets of Winnetka. The Vance estate sat at the end of a long circular driveway lined with manicured boxwoods and imported Italian cypress trees. The kind of landscaping that sends a message. We control everything, right down to the shrubbery. I pulled the Mercury through the iron gate and up to the front entrance. A young man in a black vest was stationed near the door. Not quite a valet, not quite a butler, something in between, whose job, as far as I could tell, was to make arriving guests feel either welcomed or appraised, depending on what they pulled up in. He looked at the Mercury, then at me, then back at the Mercury, with an expression I have seen many, many times in my life. The expression of a young man rapidly calculating whether the vehicle in front of him indicated a guest he needed to treat well, or one he could safely ignore. He recovered professionally. "Good evening, sir. I can take your vehicle around back." I handed him the keys. "Thank you, son. Just a heads up. The driver's side door squeaks something awful, and the parking brake likes to stick. Be patient with her." He nodded, his face a careful mask of a man trying very hard not to have any additional feelings about what he had just been asked to park. I walked up the stone steps and Richard Vance opened the heavy oak door before I could ring. He was a tall man, 74 years old, broad shoulders, a full head of silver hair, the kind of presence that had probably walked into boardrooms his entire life and never once wondered whether he belonged. He was dressed in what I would call casual aristocrat, a cashmere sweater, gray slacks, loafers that probably cost $800. His smile was warm, practiced, assembled, not felt. He said, "Teddy, so glad you could make it. Come in, come in." His handshake lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and not a single second longer. I stepped inside and the house was everything the driveway had promised. Vaulted ceilings, oil paintings on the walls, chosen for impressiveness, not for love. A curving staircase that seemed aware of its own beauty. Every single surface whispered the same thing. We have always had this. We were born into this. Our life has simply looked like this forever. Vivienne Vance emerged from a sitting room to my left. She was elegant in the specific way that wealthy women of a certain generation are elegant, precise, assembled, not a hair out of place. Her jewelry was understated in that very specific way that extraordinarily expensive jewelry is understated, which is to say, it was not understated at all. She took both my hands in hers, the way certain women do when they want physical contact to substitute for actual warmth. She said, "Teddy, we have heard so much about you. You are just as darling as Camille described." Darling, right there. The first adjective out of her mouth. Darling. Not impressive, not distinguished, not accomplished. Darling, the word people use for babies, golden retrievers, and elderly uncles who still write letters by hand. I said, "Thank you, Vivienne. You have a beautiful home." She absolutely glowed. People who have built their entire identity around their possessions never get tired of hearing those possessions praised. Camille appeared from down the hallway. She came straight to me and wrapped her arms around me the way she has since she was 3 years old. I held that hug just a half-second longer than usual. She whispered, "You look nice, Dad." I whispered back, "So do you, sweetheart." Preston materialized behind her. He looked at my cardigan, and for exactly 1/2 of 1 second I saw it. A flicker, a tiny, barely there pinched expression at the corner of his mouth that said, I specifically told him to dress up. And then the recovery smile, the professional grin, the CEO grin. He clapped me on the shoulder. "Teddy, glad you made it. Come on in. Dad just opened a 25-year-old Bordeaux." 25-year-old Bordeaux. That was going to be the theme of the evening. Everything was going to be special. The wine, the meal, the house, the family, everything, except me. We moved into the formal dining room. The table was set with the kind of deliberate theatrical formality that takes someone hours to arrange, and is designed very specifically to make certain guests feel the gap between themselves and their hosts. Crystal goblets, heavy sterling silverware, 3 forks. Candles that had never been lit before that night and would almost certainly never be lit again. I sat down. I unfolded my linen napkin. I looked around that table at those people, and I chose to become invisible, not because anyone made me invisible, because I decided to be. I have spent 67 years on this earth learning one essential truth. The most dangerous thing any man can do in a room full of people who have underestimated him is correct that underestimation too soon. So I sat, I smiled, I asked polite, soft questions. I complimented wine I hadn't tasted yet, and I watched. Richard Vance led the conversation the way men like Richard always lead conversations. From the front, loudly, with the absolute confidence of a man who has never once in his adult life been told he was taking up too much oxygen in a room, he talked about the stock market, about a fly fishing trip to Montana, about Preston's, and I quote, remarkable instincts, at Halverson. Richard said, Preston has completely transformed that company. The board is very impressed. Leadership is in the blood, I've always said. He looked at me meaningfully, and I want to pause here for a moment, because if you've ever been at a dinner table like this, where somebody is speaking about you without actually speaking to you, where every compliment directed at somebody else is really a subtle comparison to you, you know how exhausting that is. You know how your jaw starts to hurt from smiling. You know how the candlelight starts to feel a little too bright, and you know exactly how much you want to just get up and leave. But I didn't leave, because I had a feeling. And my feelings, they've been working for 42 years without a single serious misfire. I nodded appreciatively at Richard. I said, well, you must be very proud. Vivienne then turned to Camille with a smile that had a very particular shape. She said, Camille, you must feel so fortunate, having a husband who provides so well. Not every young woman gets to have that kind of security these days, especially in this economy. The table went completely silent for exactly 1/2 of a heartbeat. I saw Camille's jaw tighten, just slightly, just enough for a father to see. I picked up my water glass. I took a slow, unhurried sip. I said absolutely nothing, because the envelope had not yet arrived. And I knew with the absolute quiet certainty of a man who has been patient for 42 years that when it did, every single thing at that dining table was going to change. I just had to wait a little longer. There is a moment in every long game when patience stops being a virtue and becomes a verdict. That moment arrived with dessert. I had been sitting at that table for 2 hours and 15 minutes. 2 hours of nodding. 2 hours of asking polite questions I already had the answers to. 2 hours of laughing at Richard's stories that weren't quite as funny as Richard seemed to believe. I had played my role flawlessly. The sweet old man, Camille's retired dad, the fellow with the funny car, and the J.C. Penney cardigan. I wore that role like a comfortable old flannel shirt all evening. And not one person at that table suspected for even a single second that underneath that cardigan was something else entirely. Then Richard reached beneath his chair, and I felt it. That quiet internal shift I have learned to recognize over 4 decades in the business world. The shift that happens when a moment moves from prologue into actual story. He placed a dark leather portfolio on the table. He smoothed it once with the flat of his palm, and he slid it across the polished mahogany toward me. He said, Teddy, there's something we'd like to discuss as a family. I looked at the portfolio. I did not touch it. Vivienne's hands were folded neatly on the tablecloth. Preston had straightened in his chair with the posture of a man trying very hard to look casual about something that was not casual at all. Camille glanced at me, quick, uncertain. She looked back at her father-in-law. I looked at Camille's hands in her lap. They were not still. Her thumb was rubbing the side of her index finger, which was something she had done since she was 9 years old whenever she was nervous but didn't want to show it. Richard cleared his throat. He said, Preston has a vision, a real, ambitious, one-of-a-kind vision, an independent venture, his own company, built from scratch, the kind of opportunity that only comes along once in a man's life. As it should, I said warmly. What we need, Richard continued, is startup capital. And what we are proposing, right here in this document, is a very clean, very legal, completely above-board arrangement. Camille's inheritance, the one you will be leaving her someday, would serve as collateral for the initial round of private funding. It is fully compliant, fully drawn up by our attorneys, completely standard. He paused. He leaned forward. We simply need your blessing, Teddy, as Camille's father. He looked at Vivienne, whose smile had that fixed quality of something carefully applied rather than felt. Then he looked at Preston, who was calm, confident, already mentally spending money he had convinced himself was his. And I sat there and I thought, you have absolutely no earthly idea who you just slid that folder across the table to. I picked up the portfolio. I opened it. I read every single page, slowly, deliberately. Candles flickered. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked. Nobody spoke. I read every carefully worded paragraph, every number, every signature line, every footnote. Then I closed the folder. I set it gently back on the table. I picked up my water glass. I took a slow, unhurried sip, and I looked at Richard Vance with the warmest smile I had in my entire collection. I said, I really appreciate the thought that went into this. I'll review it carefully. Richard exhaled like a man who had been holding his breath for an hour. Preston's shoulders dropped a full inch. Vivienne reached for her wine with the relieved energy of a woman who believed the dangerous part was over. They thought they had won. I finished my water. I made pleasant conversation for another 25 minutes. I thanked Vivienne for a magnificent dinner. I complimented the lamb. I shook Richard's hand, a full handshake this time, firm. My eyes holding his one single second longer than was strictly necessary. Richard didn't understand what that second meant, but someday he would. I walked out to the driveway. The young valet brought the Mercury around with the expression of a man who had spent the last 2.5 hours making peace with what he had been asked to park. I tipped him generously, 3 times what he was expecting. I watched his face change. Got in. The engine turned over. The heater thought about it and decided against it. I pulled out of the Vance estate and I drove south on Sheridan Road, and then onto Lakeshore Drive, past the quiet dark water of Lake Michigan, past the skyline of downtown Chicago lit up like a constellation you could almost touch, and I was so calm it probably would have frightened anybody who knew what I was about to do. I said nothing for 15 days. Not one word, not one visible ripple. I went to 8 o'clock Mass at St. Margaret's. I had coffee with Donnie O'Shaughnessy on Wednesday. I drove to the grocery store on 103rd Street. I fixed a loose hinge on my kitchen cabinet. On day 4, Preston texted me. He wrote, "Hey Teddy, just checking in. Hope you got a chance to look at the proposal. Really exciting stuff. Big things coming." I waited 4 hours. Then I typed, "Still reviewing, son. These things take time." He sent back a thumbs up emoji. I put my phone down. I made a phone call, not to Preston, not to Richard, to 3 very specific people. The senior members of the Halverson Freight Solutions Board of Directors. Men who had known me for 15 years. Men who understood with absolute clarity that when I called them directly, from my personal line, it was not a social call. I said, run a full audit, standard cycle, full scope, begin immediately. I hung up. I went back to my garden. Because here is what I knew that Preston Vance did not know. Here is what Richard and Vivienne Vance, sitting in their Winnetka estate toasting each other over that 25-year-old Bordeaux, did not know. I had personally written Preston's employment contract. Every single clause, every single line, including one particular clause buried deep in Section 14, Paragraph 3. A non-compete and fiduciary duty provision that Preston had signed 3 years ago without reading it nearly carefully enough. A clause I had originally drafted 16 years before Preston Vance ever walked into my daughter's life. A clause I had drafted specifically for men who someday might convince themselves that they were smarter than the room they were standing in. I had been patient for 16 years. I could be patient for 15 more days. Now, if I can just step out of the story for a moment and talk to you directly, I want to tell you something. If you are ever in a situation where somebody disrespects you, betrays you, or takes you for a fool, I want you to hear this. Hunger is loud, but precision is quiet. The world will tell you to confront, to explode, to react. But the truly powerful response is to be so calm, so measured, so prepared, that when the moment finally comes, there is nothing to argue about. There is only the truth laid flat on the table, impossible